أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين بارئ الخلائق أجمعين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين المبعوث رحمة للعالمين شفيع المذنبين حبيب قلوب الصادقين سيدنا ومولانا أبي القاسم محمد اللهم صل على محمد وعلى أهل بيته الأطيبين الأطهرين الهداة المهديين ولعنة الله على أعدائهم إلى قيام يوم الدين رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي أما بعد. Dear brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. So far in our discussions of tafsir, we've seen a few concepts that are important for our understanding of the Quran. One of those concepts is to respect the ambiguity of the Quran, to respect where the Quran is not very clear and very direct, and not to always insist on making a conclusive answer that this is who the verse is referring to, this is what the verse is talking about, because that can limit our understanding. Even if it's accurate, it can limit your understanding. There's many people who succeed in life, in business, or in a certain field, and they will say that it was my failure that gave me the ability to succeed in the future. If I had succeeded on my first try, then I might have thought things were easy and I might never have made the same efforts or gone back and questioned some of my earlier conclusions, and I might have succeeded there, but I might have failed many times in the future. But when I made a spectacular mistake, then I went back, I relearned things, I experimented, and I was able to succeed. So that's what we need to do with the Quran as well. And that might be one reason why in ahadith of Ahlul Bayt we don't have as much focus on Sha'n al-Nuzul as we have the focus on the present applicability and the extensions of the Quran. That's not a diversion, but it is something that's very important for our ability to use the Quran, to learn from it, preserving our openness, not limiting it to our present understanding. So we applied this to Surah Abasa wa Tawalla. We discussed two verses or two series of verses in particular. Who was the referent to Abasa wa Tawalla an ja'ahu al-a'ma, and then the verse فَلْيَنْظُرِ الْإِنسَانُ إِلَىٰ طَعَامِهِ. Just between those I want to make a quick point and then move on. When the Quran describes how it is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created, or how it is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants the Prophet to prioritize who to listen to. That a blind person with no worldly attributes that commend him to you. Power, influence, any kind of wealth, anything that would make that person seem like a very important figure to have in the beginning. And another person who might have all of those material attributes, but does not have that spiritual receptivity. When the Prophet is being told how to make that decision, what is it that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions immediately after that? He mentions the stages of our creation. That is something that is instructive for the Prophet as a guide to determine who is going to be receptive to his message. And for us to determine that we are receptive to the message as well. Because the Quran, it can easily become something that we forget about, the importance of participating in our religious events, of staying connected to our religious priorities. All of that can easily become almost on the back burner in our lives when we're busy and we have many other things going on and many other interests and things that we want to see and things that we want to do. Then it might seem like coming to the masjid every week or coming to a program, it might not be the most attractive use of our time. So to maintain that receptivity, to contemplate where we came from, that is something that is very important. And to contemplate where the Qur'an is coming from. Who is it that is the messenger, and where is the origin of this book? And so in Surah Abasa we have both of these. When the Qur'an says that إِنَّهَا تَذْكِرَةٌ, this is a reminder, then what comes after that is first the information about where is the Qur'an coming from. فِي صُحُفٍ مُكَرَّمَةٍ مَرْفُوعَةٍ مُطَهَّرَةٍ بِأَيْدِي سَفَرَةٍ كِرَامٍ بَرَرَةٍ. The Qur'an is coming from the highest company. And then Allah describes where people come from. مِنْ أَيِّ شَيْءٍ خَلَقَهُ مِنْ نُطْفَةٍ خَلَقَهُ فَقَدَّرَهُ. So who are we and what is our origin? We have to remember that. And what is the origin of the Qur'an and the sublimity that it comes from? That is something that we also have to bear in mind. Those two attributes are going to be influential in our ability to benefit from the message. And some of our acts of worship, they have limited us in certain ways in order to help us remember that message. So for example, Hajj and the state of Ihram. That's probably the most perfect example that we have of not being able to look in a mirror, not being able to groom ourselves. There's many of us that if there's a knock on the door, even if we have to go to the emergency room, we probably would not be comfortable going to the emergency room unless we spend about 20 minutes, 40 minutes grooming ourselves and making sure that nobody finds out that we have a white hair, or that we have a bald spot, or that we have a blemish. So we have that tendency to live very artificial lives, and we're not comfortable with ourselves and comfortable in our own skin. And sometimes we might feel that tension, even if there's an emergency, that, well, I need to be presentable. Our house needs to be presentable. Ihram and Hajj is that reminder that don't forget who you really are, and how quick it is that the body can be something that is unpleasant to one's own self, let alone to other people. And so that is a reminder. But we have a similar reminder built into our other acts of worship as well. For example, in Salat, I'm sure that many of you have heard the hadith that the raka'at of your Salat are a symbol of a human lifespan. That you go into the first sujood, and it symbolizes that you are created from the earth. And then you sit after sujood, and you say, Astaghfirullah Rabbi wa atubu ilayh. That your worldly existence is a separation from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And no matter what we might do and how great we might think that we are, in reality, everything in our life should be istighfar. Because it represents a separation from our Creator. So it makes sense, even for us to do istighfar for our ibadat. That I finish Salatul Maghrib and I say, Astaghfirullah, oh Allah, I didn't do as good an ibadah as I should have done, as you are worthy of. So that is between the two sujoods, and then you go back to sujood, and that symbolizes return to Allah, and then you sit up, and that symbolizes resurrection. That symbolizes the ba'ath, the qiyamah. So, ihram is a very visual representation, a very clear representation that remember where you're coming from, remember the real state of your own body, but we have a similar reminder for rich and poor at all times of the year in every salat. And in our other acts of worship, to know who we are, where we're coming from, that's a major factor in receptivity to achieving guidance. And the other part of that is to recognize the sublimity of the Qur'an. The greatness of the Qur'an does not lie just in the eloquence, or the beauty of its words, or the beauty of its recitation, or the beauty of calligraphy with which it can be represented and written. All of those are great. It's very beautiful that Islamic civilization has developed that art of writing the Quran, that art of reciting the Quran, that art of memorizing, and then being able to recite and to read from memory the surahs of the Quran. All of those are great, but they are only a very small part of what makes the Quran miraculous and what makes the Quran great. The major part of it is the fact that it is a living book. The fact that it is a book that has a greater spiritual depth than existence itself. Which is why, if it were revealed to a mountain, لَرَأَيْتَهُ خَاشِعًا مُتَصَدِّعًا مِنْ خَشْيَةِ اللَّهِ, that you would see it be a mountain that would take the effect of that Quranic revelation. So those messages, they are a little bit of a change from what many Muslims are used to hearing. Many of you might have heard that the miracle of the Quran is that God preserved this text, and that not a single letter of the Quran has been changed, not a single dot of the Quran has been changed, and not a single vowel of the Quran has been changed. If any of you heard that or learned that perhaps in Sunday school or as children or maybe even in a lecture, that's not true. If you look at the recitations of the Quran, there are differences about some of the vowels. So for example, in Surah Al-Fatiha, you can say, Maliki Yawmiddin, which means the owner of the Day of Judgment. And you can say Maliki Yawmiddin, which means king of the Day of Judgment. Those are two different vowels. One is Malik with an alif, and one is Malik without an alif. The meaning does not change very much, because the owner of the Day of Judgment is the king of the Day of Judgment. لِمَنِ الْمُلْكُ الْيَوْمِ. That is a verse of the Quran where he is the king on that day. And if you are the king of something, then you are the owner, the possessor, the one who has authority over it. And the writing of the Quran here is also not changed. It is written Mim, Lam, Kaf, and there is just a sign for the alif. But there is a different vocalization. So the fact that no vowels of the Quran have changed is not accurate. The fact that no dots of the Quran have changed is not even a question that we should ask, because the dots were not originally there in the same way in all of the original scripts of the Quran. So these, even the dot under the ba, the dots did exist, but they did not always exist in the same way and for the same purpose as they do now. Then, if we're shaking people's understanding, what about the letters? Are at least the letters all the same? Even here, there are some differences, and one example is in Surah Takwir, which is the next surah that we're going to look at. In Surah Takwir, we have a verse where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes the Prophet and or Jibreel. And he says, وَمَا هُوَ عَلَى الْغَيْبِ بِالضَّنِينَ. This verse has been recited by the Qurra, by reciters, in two different ways, with two different letters. One is وَمَا هُوَ عَلَى الْغَيْبِ بِالضَّنِينَ, with a Dad. And one is وَمَا هُوَ عَلَى الْغَيْبِ بِالضَّنِينَ, with a Dha. So two different letters. The writing will be with the Dad. That is the more prevalent recitation. But another recitation that is found, and if you look at the Sunni Mufassirin in the community, they say that both of those recitations are correct, and both of them are mutawatir, meaning both of them have been unanimously and consecutively narrated from the Prophet. There's two different letters, and it's not even like Malik and Malik, where we can say it's very similar or almost the same meaning. The meaning is different. I'll explain it in just a moment. So my point is that as Muslims, we shouldn't take pride in those things that are only partially accurate or might be somewhat misunderstood. Because if you go online, you will see many Christians or many missionaries, and they will object to those kinds of simplistic statements that are made by some Muslims, and they will say, well, that's not actually true. And then they will bring an example, and many Muslim youth, many Muslims who may have heard that message from their parents, heard that message in Sunday school, their faith will shake. Because they thought that no dot changed, no vowel changed, no letter changed, and the reality is that it's not like that at all. Now, even if we say that there are some questions, like I will just talk about in Surah Takwir, how much of the Quran, how many verses have these questions? Aside from just pronunciation issues. Pronunciation doesn't really count. It's a question of accent. Just like in English, if you go to the southern United States, I was born and raised in this country, and sometimes I have a hard time understanding people who are talking with a real deep southern accent. So it's a question of accent, it's the same words. I can understand what they're writing, usually, but not always understand what they're saying. So if we take aside those questions of accent, how many verses of the Quran have an actual question where the meaning might be slightly different? Out of thousands of verses, more than 6,000 verses, we have just a handful, maybe 5 or 7 verses, where we have a question that is relevant at the level of meaning. It's a very limited amount of verses. And even out of those verses, almost none of them deal with questions of practice or law. In other words, it doesn't make a difference in your practice. There's only 1 or 2 examples where it makes a difference in your practice. And that too has been explained by hadith. But the reason I gave that whole introduction is for 2 reasons, actually. One is so that we don't give a message which is simplistic and not accurate. The second is so that we don't take pride in the Quran for those things that are not the true beauty of the Quran. But we should take pride in the Quran for those things that are actually what make it unique, what distinguish it, and which are beautiful. The fact that throughout the world and throughout the centuries, Muslims have a text that has been remarkably well preserved. And that we only have 5 or 7 verses where we even have a question beyond accent about how to recite and what the words of those verses mean. That is nothing short of a miracle. But more importantly, the miracle of the Quran is the way that it interacts with the human soul and is able to lift us from our material existence to our spiritual existence. That's not so easy for me to impress somebody else and win a debate against a Christian or against a Jew or against a non-Muslim. It's not so easy for me to make somebody else feel like they've lost and I've won a debate. It's something that requires humility, and it's something that requires a lifelong process of learning and trying to connect to the text and apply the text to see the effect. And that's why it might not always be as attractive for those of us who want to be polemic and want to win debates. But that is the true beauty of the Quran. That is the true miracle of the Quran. So now what is the meaning of this one verse? Well, let's begin from the beginning of Surah Takwir and we'll come down. I mentioned that because it's related to the text of the Quran and also because it relates to the question that we had in Surah Abasa wa Tawalla of the sublimity of the Quran. The high rank of the Quranic text and where it comes from, that is also related to this verse of Surah Takwir that we will talk about today. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. So keep that question in mind, but let's begin from the start of the verse of the surah. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. إِذَا الشَّمْسُ كُوِّرَتْ وَإِذَا النُّجُومُ انْكَدَرَتْ وَإِذَا الْجِبَالُ سُيِّرَتْ وَإِذَا الْعِشَارُ عُطِّلَتْ وَإِذَا الْوُحُوشُ حُشِرَتْ وَإِذَا الْبِحَارُ سُجِّرَتْ وَإِذَا النُّفُوسُ زُوِّجَتْ وَإِذَا الْمَوْءُودَةُ سُئِلَتْ بِأَيِّ ذَنْبٍ قُتِلَتْ. Several questions. The first 6 verses of this surah paint a very vivid picture. when the sun will be wrapped up, and the stars will go dark, and the mountains will begin to move, and all of these types of cataclysmic events will take place. And then the Quran has a message that it draws upon that. Now here is the question. Normally, we associate the sun with shining. The Quran says that it's going to be wrapped up. We associate the stars with the brightness of their light, the twinkling of their light. And the Quran says that they're going to go dark. We associate mountains with firmness and stability. In every language you'll find a parable or an idiom of how mountains are firm. And the Quran says, suyirat, they're going to go as if they're on a walk. Right? وَإِذَا الْوُحُوشُ حُشِرَتْ. Now, wuhush means wild animals. By definition, wuhush are those animals that are not domesticated and not domesticable. And that's what it means to be wahshi. Right? And now they're going to come and they're going to be gathered together as if they have no innate independence and no innate desire to be separate. So when these, وَإِذَا الْبِحَارُ سُجِّرَتْ, when the seas will be set alight. Normally we think of water as that which extinguishes fire, and here it's the water itself that's going to be the fuel for the fire. Now, everything is exactly the opposite of what you would normally expect. And here is my question. Did Allah have a cap that He puts on where He is a Hollywood movie director, for example, where He needs to draw the right scene for people, and He said that, well, the Day of Judgment, it's the end of humanity, we need to have a good scene. And so then God sets the stage. What's the need of all of these cataclysmic events? If Qiyamat is about me and you accounting for our deeds, do we need to see the stars go dark? Do we need to see the sun wrapped up? Do we need to see the mountains on fire and the mountains moving and the seas on fire? If anything, that scenery might actually distract us from the accounting that we're going to have to do. If you go to H&R Block, then you'll find that their offices are relatively plain. They don't have a very exciting decor. Unlike if you go to an amusement park, and there's a reason for that. Because the amusement park wants you to kind of forget yourself and part with your money. But that accounting office, that law office, they want you to be present and to be able to think about facts and accurate things. Hollywood marketing also, one of the reasons why they have those special effects is because it might actually make you forget the fact that the acting and the story and the meaning of what you're watching is not actually that meaningful. So it's a little bit of a distraction. So how do we understand these verses? Allah does not need to do all of these things in order for us to have an accounting of our actions. And these are all the muqaddimat of the hisab and the accounting of the Day of Judgment. So that's the question. Do we have any answers that the audience would like to volunteer? So maybe it's to establish fear, but then the question does come that it's a very powerful image, but it can also be distractive. It's to remove us from our element. I think the key to answering that question is when we come to verse number 14 of this surah. The result of all of these fantastic elements and what we're not used to is not to distract us, But the Quran says that when all of these things take place, right? وَإِذَا الْجَحِيمُ سُعِّرَتْ وَإِذَا الْجَنَّةُ أُزْلِفَتْ عَلِمَتْ نَفْسٌ مَا أَحْضَرَتْ. That the soul will know what it brought. So in reality, that stage that is being set by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is being set so that we will truly know the value of things. We will truly know the value of things. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He makes all those cosmic changes, and that's just a preliminary. And then He brings the book which accounts for our actions. He brings Jannah, He brings Jahannam. It's all in front of us. And it doesn't mean that we're distracted from our deeds, but it means عَلِمَتْ نَفْسٌ مَا أَحْضَرَتْ. We will be more able to understand and then to appreciate what it was that we did. So what is it that causes that? Now, if you travel sometimes, I don't know if you've ever experienced this, where you have a mental block, you're writing something, you're trying to work on a problem, and you have a block at finding the answer. And you know that this should be easy for you, but you're just not able to go forward. It might be on the tip of your tongue, you're not able to go forward. And then, what's the best thing that you can do at that time? Do a 2-rakah prayer, for 2 reasons. Because prayer brings barakah from Allah, and then when we pray, we also remember everything that we otherwise forget. So for both reasons, prayer is often the best thing. But even aside from that, if you change your pace, you just go to nature. Sometimes when you're not putting that pressure on yourself, you're in a different environment, then you're able to understand things better. Something that subconscious block prevented you from understanding or from appreciating. All of us have probably experienced something similar. So when is it that something will be, that change of pace will help us, and when is it that it will hinder us? A change of pace can hinder, and a change of pace can help. When is it that it can hinder? If it distracts us with something that is not important, then it can easily hinder us. There's many people who get so involved in work that they forget their family. The reason is that that distraction has become something which they think is important, and so it detracts from what is truly important. You can go to nature, and you can also forget things that are truly important in your life. It's not always going to be something that will be beneficial. And then there are times when it is useful. Where is it useful? It's useful if it doesn't distract you from what is more important, but it clarifies for you what actually is. Going to work can also make you appreciate more deeply the importance of your family. Going to nature can actually make you appreciate more deeply the reality of your existence and the importance of worship of God and the humility of our own existence. Is it going to distract us, or is it going to bring us into a closer realization of what is real? So then, we can say that when the Quran is describing these events, in reality what the Quran is telling us is that all of these preliminary changes, to us they seem like a big deal. The sky is falling, the seas are burning, the earth is quaking and the mountains are moving. It seems like everything is changing. Reality itself is changing. But on a deeper level, because this is the muqaddimah, the preliminary for what? عَلِمَتْ نَفْسٌ مَا أَحْضَرَتْ. This is making us see things more accurately, more real, and not less real, not a distraction. Is that change clear? That this is not just a matter of Allah changing things, but it's not Allah alaykum salam, wanting to cause fear in us, but it is Allah wanting us to be able to see things more accurately and more real. This material world that we thought was everything all of a sudden we will see how quickly it changes. And then that fear that you described, that is the natural result or the effect of the fact that we had put all of our eggs in the basket of our material existence. And all of a sudden we see that that basket has been snatched away. So not that Allah wants to create the fear is the result of the fact that we thought that the sun and the moon and the mountains and the earth and what exists within the heavens and the earth, that is important. That's worth living for. It's worth dying for. It's worth fighting for. It's worth doing injustice for. And so Allah, He reverses that. And if we understand that point, then these examples are not just for us to think about as a prophecy of what's going to happen before the Day of Judgment. But they are a reminder for us that that is the reality of the world. Jannah is not something magical that Allah is withholding from us for now, and He's going to give to us later. If we are a believer, this is the Jannah that we are preparing. If we are unbelievers, then however much we might be enjoying life, we think we're enjoying it, but our soul is in Jahannam, even if our body is living it up. And similarly, all of these cataclysmic changes that are going to take place, the sun and the stars and the heavens and the earth, they are the reality of that material existence. It's just like something that can be crumbled within your hand and then fall to the ground as dust. It's not something worth wasting our soul and our life for. And all of this comes from that recognition of the fact that there is a more sublime and a higher existence. And so Surah Takwir, just like Surah Abasa before it, it describes the sublimity of where the Qur'an comes from. And this is where the verse وَمَا هُوَ عَلَى الْغَيْبِ بِضَنِينَ comes from. Because we're short on time, I'll mention just the two meanings and the two tafsirs. If we read it according to the majority reading, which is with a dad, then it comes from the meaning of to be stingy, to withhold. And the meaning is that the Prophet doesn't withhold the affairs of ghaib. If Allah has not told us when the Day of Judgment is going to come, if Allah has not told us when the 12th Imam is going to come, if Allah has not told us when we're going to die, it's not because He's stingy. It's because we have to not know. That's important for our guidance. So don't try to find that dhikr, don't try to find that dua, don't try to find that istikhara, don't try to find that code that allows you to get at all of the ghaib. If you need to know, when you need to know, God will disclose it. He's not stingy. Jibreel is not stingy. And the Prophet is not stingy. Sometimes people ask for an istikhara, and you tell them the result. If it comes out good, they say that, okay, so that means that everything's going to work out? And no. If an istikhara comes out good, it means do it. If it comes out bad, it means don't do it. If it comes out do it and you wanted to engage in a business transaction, you might lose financially. And if it comes out no, you might have had a lot of profit if you had done it. The istikhara is not a crystal ball telling you what is going to happen and how you can maximize your returns. That's why Robert Mercer is a billionaire, because of his computer programs, not because he used to do istikhara before every investment. Istikhara is there to resolve disputes about moral decisions where I'm unable to decide and I don't have anybody to give me good advice. It's to remove me from a moral quandary. If you want to find out how to make the most profit, don't go for istikhara. Go and find an algorithm that'll predict the future, at least reduce your uncertainty. There's different mechanisms to reduce uncertainty about material results. Our religious teachings of dua and all of the different types of istikhara, they are to reduce spiritual uncertainty. Because God is not stingy about ghaib. That ghaib which needs to be disclosed to us, He will disclose to us through the mechanisms that He has told us. If something is withheld, then it needs to be withheld. What is the other tafsir? It's وَمَا هُوَ عَلَى الْغَيْبِ dhaneen. Dhaneen comes from dhan, which means thought, presumption. And it means that there is no suspicion that the Prophet or that Jibreel or that God is subject to about the news of the ghaib. So if the Prophet says, for example, that there is a day of judgment, then we don't have dhan, we don't have a bad kind of connotation or impression of what the Prophet might have intended. He is sadiq and he is ameen. So you can see that even though there's different meanings, the end result is not that far apart, but there are two different words, they have two different tafsirs. The gist, though, is very similar, which is that God does not withhold, and God is not to be doubted about the ghaib. Withholding is that which we don't know, and doubted is that which He has told us, but the point is that we can trust the message of the Qur'an. And those are part of the verses that are discussing the sublimity of the sublimeness of the Quranic message. We are out of time, and so with that, inshallah, we will conclude. I ask you all to please recite a Surah Fatiha for the sponsors of tonight's majlis.